Okay, so another bit of news is that the Federal Trade Commission in the US has ended the practice of non-compete clauses in employment contracts. So basically, you can't have a thing that says you can't go work for a competitor anymore. So I think that's big news. It's quite interesting. How do we think this affects employees and the sort of the founder startup space more generally?
I'm not sure how enforced non-competes were in lots of different places, right? So in the UK, in Australia, they've been pretty toothless for a long time. It's been hard to enforce a non-compete that's going to take someone out of the earning environment.
California has already been essentially, you can't do non-competes, which is where Silicon Valley has been. And people attribute actually good things to that it creates this environment of innovation. You're not stuck at some big company. You can go do your own startup, or you could like move around, and employees are highly valued and so on. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. Like, do I think a fast food worker should be subject to a non-compete? No, I think it's absurd. Do I think a tech exec who understands algorithms and can competently contract with their employer and say, I'm essentially getting paid more to agree to a non-compete after? I think the law banning that's kind of silly. And most important of all, and this is where my lawyerness comes out, the FTC absolutely has no authority to do this. Like, there's no chance that some regulatory body has been charged by the US Congress to go invalidate a bunch of contracts. It's insane from a regulatory standpoint. That being said, like, Congress could pass a law saying, hey, if you're under this salary level, this is crazy. You're not subject to IP. That's really competitive and so on. But the FTC meddling in this stuff is just sort of a worrisome regulatory trend in my view.
I think, first of all, you're right that they're rarely enforced. And in California, they've actually been unenforceable for a long time. I'm not sure if that means they're not in people's contracts, but I think that's the thing. They are used as just a sort of a bullying tactic by employers. It's not the case that they will actually enforce the non-compete, but they will threaten to, and it will be in the contract, and it will basically make it harder for people to leave. You know, I have a friend here in Australia who is an occupational therapist, right? So not in tech. She wanted to start her own business, and her employer tried to stop her on the basis of a non-compete. Not non-solicitation, which is different, right? She wasn't going to take any of her own old clients, but simply to set up business. They were like, we're going to sue you based on the non-compete. She nearly didn't do that because of the threat, even though it was unlikely to be enforceable. So I think in general, it's good to allow people to do what they like with their time and with their labor. To the point of trade secrets, I think, yeah, that's interesting. Maybe when you're senior enough, it can be problematic. But I think that's where in investment banking, that's where the old concept of gardening leave came from, which is to say, we use a carrot instead of a stick. Instead of saying, you cannot go and compete, we will pay you for 6 months to sit around and do nothing. That's why it's called gardening leave. It is paid for by the employer that wants to make sure that whatever knowledge you have goes stale before you join your new employer. And I think that is maybe a fairer thing as an employer to say, well, you know, if I want to stop somebody jumping straight to another job, I can do that, but I pay for it. I don't get to just restrict another person's freedom in that way beyond the time when I pay for them.
Yeah, but I don't know if the new FTC rule would agree that the garden leave concept works. They're like, that's non-competitive too.
I mean, if it's by mutual consent, then it's okay, right?
That's the whole point. Mutual consent. At what point do we allow mutual consent by sophisticated parties to like do what they want?
Well, it's interesting. And, you know, I think your point is valid, Emil. And like in Australia, we have laws around what's called unfair dismissal. So, you know, it's not an at-will employment country. And so if you get fired, you can make a claim for unfair dismissal. But that protection cuts out past a certain salary point where we say, okay, if you are highly paid and senior, then those unfair dismissal protections, which are really important if you're a fast food worker, right? They're no longer so important. And you have significantly fewer rights as a highly paid employee. And I think maybe for non-competes, there's a case to be made that that's how it should be structured.
It seems to be that we've been trying to have our cake and eat it a bit, though, where we don't want someone to go and quite rightly don't want them to go and take their knowledge, their experience and so on and enrich a competitor directly the day after they leave the business. But we also don't want to pay them. So we can't have it both ways, I think. If we want to pay someone for the privilege of sitting around for 6 months doing gardening leave and that protects our business, then that's all right. But if we're not willing to do that, then we also don't get to ask them to sit things out out for 3 months while we figure out what we're going to do next. Or they have to change careers. Like, things are getting more niche as well. So if we're asking someone to not stay in their niche, but we're not willing to pay them for the privilege of that, then we don't get to have it both ways. That's the concern, I think. The more pressing question is, what would each of you do with 6 months gardening leave? Because I think I'd enjoy the first day, potentially the first week, and then after that, I think I'd start to go a bit crazy.
I recommend starting a podcast.